Welcome back to our class. Last class session or last video, we talked about Paul and how he ended up starting the church there in Corinth, and when he moved away, some of the problems that came with his moving away that created this leadership vacuum. And then three men delivered a letter from Corinth to Ephesus, where Paul was staying at the time, letting him know that there were some issues in the church. And also, these people from Chloe came and gave him a report that there were some issues going on. So Paul writes the letter, the first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus. That's important to note. And he wrote this letter in response to the report, the verbal report from Chloe's people, and in response to a letter that he received from the three guys who came from Corinth. He sent his first letter back with one of those three gentlemen, and this session we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians, the letter that he wrote. I think Galatians and Thessalonians, like I've already said, came first. And then in Paul's letter to the Galatians, he talks about how long of a letter he writes when he writes in his own hand. I think that's probably indicative of the fact that Galatians came first, because he wrote much longer letters than that in his correspondence with the Corinthians and Romans. So here's a long letter that Paul writes to address specific issues in the church there in Corinth. And if you want to outline the book of 1 Corinthians, here's how I would outline that book. Chapter 1 through chapter 4 deals specifically with divisions within the congregation based on leadership. And chapters 5 through 7 deal with some of those specific issues within the congregation itself related to sexual promiscuity, and I'll kind of get into that more later. But I think chapters 5 through 7 come directly from chapter 1 through 4. In other words, if these leaders were any good at all, the ones he kind of criticizes in chapters 1 through 4, then they should have been able to prevent you from creating such grievous errors in the arena of sexuality in chapters 5 through 7. Chapter 8 through 10 deal with your rights, and that's where Paul says that I'm willing to give up my right as an apostle so that I'm not be a stumbling block to the weak ones. And so he here in chapters 8 through 10, he encourages those who feel like they're strong to kind of pay attention to the weak and take care of them. Chapters 11 through 14 deal with kind of self-examination, self-exaltation that makes people unconcerned for others. So this is him kind of bringing chapters 8 through 10 to bear in chapters 11 through 14. It's basically your spiritual gifts are good, but if they don't benefit everybody, they're worthless. So he ties a direct line between people's gifts or gifts of the Spirit or manifestations of the gifts of the Spirit to the larger community, and argues that if it doesn't benefit the larger group, then it's really not worth doing. So he's pretty critical there. And all this argument of 1 Corinthians leads up to chapter 15, which is really the meat of 1 Corinthians. He lays out the gospel that he had received and that he originally preached to the church at Corinth, and then really expounded on what the main problem is in 1 Corinthians, in the Corinthian church that he sees as the issue. So chapter 15 is really the reason everything else exists. It kind of builds this argument to chapter 15, where he talks about our temporality, the time that they were living in, and how that relates to the second coming of Christ. Now, I think there was some confusion about the second coming. The word rapture is not in the New Testament. I think I wrote that in some of your posts. So that's a fact. It's not in the New Testament. But the concept of Jesus coming again is certainly there. That is the eschatological piece of the New Testament. The apocalyptic vision of the New Testament revolves around Jesus's return. So the concept is there. The word rapture is not. So that's kind of problematic, but that's a more common term. Probably in the last 57 years became a popular term. Chapter 16 is basically just a closing. It's the way Paul closes his letters. There's some important information in there about some of his travel itinerary stuff, so it shouldn't go overlooked. Read through 1 Corinthians. Get a good idea of what's going on. So that you can kind of capture Paul's addressing these issues and see how contextual this letter is. It's written specifically to a congregation dealing with very specific problems that they've asked Paul to address, and he's responding to that in 1 Corinthians. So let's spend some time with chapters 1 through 4. This is the division that's in Corinth based on leadership. I think chapters 1 through 7 respond to the people from Chloe. I think those folks asked Paul specific, they reported to Paul that there was leadership problems and people kind of believing that they are in the line of Paul or in the line of Christ or in the line of Cephas or Apollos. Those three leaders were named in that first 4 chapters. So I think chapter 1 through 7 deals specifically with the report from the people of Chloe. And I think 8 through 14 deal with some of the specific questions in the letter that Paul receives. Because there he seems like he's dealing with direct questions that were in letters. So let me back up. 1 through 7, a response to Chloe's people. 8 through 14, a response to the letter delivered by the 3 men. Now, that's my interpretation, and different scholars think different things, but I think you can roughly line that out. So chapter 1 through 4 deals specifically with the divisions of leadership. It looks like people in the church are saying, hey, listen, I follow Paul. And some were saying, no, I follow Apollos. Others were saying, I follow Cephas, which is Peter, a very important figure in early Christianity. And others saying, I follow Christ. So you have at least 4 factions within this church at Corinth, and they're kind of rallying around different leaders. And it's clear that a guy named Apollos came to Corinth and preached there. In other books, I think Acts, it talks about him being a really great speaker. So that's certainly the case. There were a lot of traveling itinerant ministers during this time period. And so they didn't all say the same thing. And I think that's evident in James and Paul's letters that we read last week, Galatians and the letter of James. So there's a lot of disagreement about what's right and what's the gospel and all that, mainly because nothing's written down. These letters are the first things being written in this early Jesus movement, and they're responding to all these kind of questions like who's in charge and what do we do now and what happens when somebody dies and Christ hasn't returned. And in Corinth, they had some of those similar issues, and Paul's responding to them. But in chapters 1 through 4, he's focused in on the division within leadership, and that's kind of the crux of what's going on there. Chapter 5 through 7 deals specifically with some of the sexual immorality or promiscuity that's happening in Corinth. Now, this is really interesting because Corinth is known in the ancient world as kind of a sin city, a place with a lot of prostitutes, a place where traders and merchants from the sea world, the merchant ships would port, and there's a large industry for prostitution. And there wasn't a strong sexual ethic in early Christianity. I mean, this stuff is still kind of being put together, and these Gentiles aren't that familiar with the Jewish scriptures or the Hebrew Bible. They just don't even know what's in there. And Greco-Roman sexual practice was fundamentally different than the way we conceive of sexuality now. In the Greco-Roman concept, there was this strong pyramid where the emperors at the very top, and the power flowed from that top. So that's how they saw the world, and the emperor was impenetrable. And so this had everything to do with a sexual ethic in the Greco-Roman world, that men were hard bodies, women were malakoi, soft bodies. And Paul actually uses that term in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the weak people, the people who are weak in faith, these very malleable, soft people. That he uses the word malakoi, which means soft. Translators usually translate that as weak. And so there's this penetration scale in the Greco-Roman world that has everything to do with sexuality. And what was gross in the Greco-Roman world was people at the bottom or people below on this social hierarchy. If they penetrated someone higher than them sexually, that was unnatural. But it was completely natural for people at the top to penetrate those who were below them, whether they were just below them or all the way at the bottom. So concepts of heterosexuality and homosexuality, that really didn't exist the way it exists today. Everything followed this penetration scale, and marriages weren't quite based on love and compassion the way they're based today. So everything is fundamentally different. So questions about what is appropriate and inappropriate sexuality were stuff these guys had no idea about, and they weren't even that familiar with Jewish sexual practice. So there's a lot of confusion, and chapter 5, 6, and 7 deal with some of the confusion in the church at Corinth. Chapter 5, apparently there's a man in the church who's sleeping with his mother-in-law. Paul's argument is that if your leaders, whoever they were any good, they would know that this isn't right. So Paul criticizes sleeping with your mother-in-law. I mean, that seems self-evident. Or a stepmother, sorry, not mother-in-law. So apparently this guy's father married a woman. The father may have died, and she's a stepmother, and he's sleeping with her. Paul says you shouldn't do that. Chapter 6 deals with prostitution. And the question for the Corinthians was, if Jesus is coming back, should I abstain from sex completely? Should I abstain from sex with my wife because she's holy and you shouldn't do that? And because I'm abstaining from sex with my wife, it's okay for me to go to the temple prostitutes in Corinth, that were all over Corinth, and satisfy my desires there. And that's probably what was happening in Corinth. Men didn't want to defile their wives because they thought Jesus was about to come back and they wanted to keep them pure. So they would go to the temple prostitutes. And we might think that's crazy now, but there's absolutely nothing in Greco-Roman culture that would say that that was wrong. And prostitution was a part of sexual normativity in that time. So there was nothing wrong with it from their conception. So Paul says you shouldn't sleep with prostitutes. You shouldn't satisfy their desires there. It's okay to sleep with your wife. And that's where chapter 7 comes in. He basically says, don't withhold conjugal rights to your spouse. Now, most people think, most interpretations believe that these were women who are withholding sexual interactions from their husbands. It's probably just the opposite of that, where the men didn't want to defile their wives and were going to temple prostitutes, so they weren't sleeping with their wives. And Paul says you should. I mean, that's actually what you should do. Unless, of course, Paul says you want to be like me and be single and celibate. So there's a lot of information about sexual morality in chapters 5, 6, and 7, but it certainly doesn't fall along the lines of the way we think of sexuality in modernity. So it's very contextual to the Corinthian church and what was happening at Corinth. And Paul's basic argument is apparently these leaders aren't doing a good job because they're not giving you some instruction on these things in particular. Chapters 8 through 10 is basically Paul giving some examples and then using himself as an example of giving up your rights in order to make sure other people don't stumble and fall. He basically says, I, as an apostle, have the liberty and the freedom to do whatever I want, specifically eat meat sacrificed to idols. But if somebody who is weaker, softer, Malachoi, sees me doing that and does it themselves and violates their own conscience, then I have made a weaker, softer Christian stumble. And he's really kind of arguing against that and kind of chastising that concept. So apparently what's happened is that there are people in the Corinthian church who think that they are spiritually superior and have a stronger and deeper knowledge of Christ than others. This is probably the wealthier people in the congregation who think they've reached that wealth and status because of God's favor, which was very common in that time period. And with this special knowledge, they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And Paul's really kind of pushing against that concept. So much so that it looks like in some sections of 1 Corinthians, the wealthier people who don't have to work are coming to these gatherings of Jesus followers, having a big meal and eating a lot of it and getting drunk before the poorer members of the movement could get there because they were working so much. So when they got there, most of the food was gone, the wine was gone, and they were, they didn't have anything. So Paul's really saying you can't do this just because you think you have a special knowledge, a special relationship with Christ, that somehow that end-time salvation, when we're really going to be saved, you have that already. He's really criticizing that and saying you don't. And just because you have a superior understanding of the Christian faith or the Jesus movement, that does not mean you can do whatever you want. As a matter of fact, you should give that up in order for those who are weaker or softer for their sake, so that they won't fall into any kind of sin. So in verses 11 through 14, he really gets very specific with speaking in tongues and the use of gifts within the congregation. And he basically says that there are some of you who are practicing these spiritual gifts, ecstatic speech, we call it glossolalia, speaking in tongues, that somehow you think you are closer to God and that you have a deeper revelation of Jesus than others because you have this capacity. And he really kind of criticizes that. And he basically says, if you're not using this for the edification of the entire congregation, it's worthless. And he really kind of, chapter 13 hammers that home. What good is gifts of angels if you have no love? What's the use of prophecy if you have not love? So he goes this litany, basically saying it's all worthless if you don't love, because love is the thing that's eternal. Love is the glue that holds the whole thing together. Chapter 13 is really important for the whole letter. Love is what holds everything together, and gifts are only useful if it makes the whole body strong. So Paul is criticizing these people who think they've already had this all this knowledge, and that's what chapter 15 is really all about. Chapter 15 says that nobody is fully saved yet, and that word saved is really important. No one is exempt from the troubles of everyday life until Jesus comes back. So this notion of second coming and a bodily resurrection is very important to Paul, and it's a part of his gospel story. This idea that people are saved is not a fully present reality. That your salvation, someone's salvation, certainly begins when they encounter Christ, but it is not fully consummated until Jesus Christ returns. So there's this tension between an experience that you've already had and one that will eventually come one day. So you're kind of in this I'm sorry, class. Hold on for just a second. Forgive me. I'm going too long is what that means. That this already not yet space, that we're not fully saved. Our salvation isn't fully complete until that day that Christ comes back. And then in the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of all believers, that's when everything is fulfilled. And until that day, we are all in this partial state of salvation. So salvation isn't one event for Paul. It's this process that will be fully realized when Christ comes back. So that drives the whole letter, and that's his criticism to the leaders who think they already have all the knowledge that they're supposed to. This is pretty strong criticism of that. And he does so through the cross of Christ. You'll hear Paul talk about the cross or the crucifixion quite a bit, and even talk about that as foolishness, that Jesus and God didn't come and use the strong and the obvious way to bring about salvation. It's actually through a cross, through what was weak, through what is foolish, that God comes and brings salvation. So that's how Paul addresses all of these issues of leadership, issues of sexuality, appropriate sexuality, issues of freedom and freedom from the law, or freedom from social practices, the concept of gifts and spiritual gifts, all wrapped up into thinking you're more than what you should think you are, kind of thing. So he's a real critic of these super spiritual folks who feel like they can do anything they want because they have this fully realized notion of Christ. Paul's criticism of that is that that's not true. We are all only partially there until the coming of Christ. So that's 1 Corinthians. Next section, we'll talk about 2 Corinthians. Any questions, please send me an email. Take care.